Welcome back to another episode of Unfiltered Freight. Really excited to have David here with me today for a very, very broad spanning conversation. So, David, first, thanks for joining. I know you have your hands in a million different stuff. So maybe just kind of give us the quick one over.
Sure. Well, I've been in freight technology, supply chain technology for over 30 years. I spent the first 27 of those years working largely in a product capacity. I've been a chief product officer, I've been heads of product, but I've also done sales and marketing and services for large public companies like Manhattan Associates, small, friends and family funded companies like Cloud Logistics, and then a few private equity held companies. The last few years, I've spent the time really working as an advisor. In that capacity, I advise software companies, and in some cases, it's around product marketing, go-to-market. I also work with private equity firms doing diligence on M&A. And then I also serve in the capacity of a few boards as well. I've been an execution guy most of my career. So I love TMS, I love WMS, a little bit of visibility, a little bit of global trade, but really when you start talking execution, warehousing, and transportation is kind of my sweet spot.
If you look at like the last 10 years, kind of how do you think about like the trajectory of where most freight technology has been focused?
It's a great question. If I think about where things have come, TMS is a pretty mature space right now. Whether you're talking about TMS for ships, you're talking about TMS for forwarders, or TMS for carriers, right? Certainly the tier one companies, the largest companies, they've had systems in place for 20 plus, 30 plus years. We went through a big push, call it 10 to 5 years ago, where a lot of the mid-market companies adopted TMS because once cloud came in, those systems became a lot more affordable. You're no longer looking at a $1 million, license fee and a 6 to 9 month implementation. That became much faster. And there were a lot of companies that came out, like Lean Logistics, like Cloud Logistics, and others that were really focused on that mid-market. And now you're even seeing some of the kind of the smallest companies adopt TMS in some shape or form. So I think we've seen now at the point where you've got the stability because now the majority of companies are running transportation software. So now they've got some level of data consistency, some level of visibility, some level of optimization or execution. So we're kind of past the basics. And so what I've seen happen a lot in the last few years is not as many companies going out there trying to build the next great TMS. Because once I've got it installed, there's going to be a pretty big event that forces me to change it. That big event might be my vendor going out of business, or my vendor sunsetting their product, or maybe me acquiring a whole new business line. So most companies are not implementing brand new TMSs. And as such, I think a lot of the innovation is really happening around the edges. And you see this both in TMS and in WMS and probably some other spaces as well, where you're seeing a whole bevy of startups over the last 5 years focus on how do we complement existing infrastructure as opposed to try to replace it. And AI is only accelerating that.
Is it actually so hard to yank out a TMS? Like I'm just thinking about, DSV and DB Schenker, right? A lot of noise going around with that acquisition that, DSV adopting DB Schenker's like home built TMS. Like do you think we'll see that happening more often, like a built in-house TMS?
So I think you have to distinguish between the two categories and the two segments, right? You've got the shippers or the BCOs, and you got the forwarders. And even then, I think you have to distinguish between the mega companies like the DB Schenker and the mid-market companies, right? I would say for a BCO, for a shipper, yanking out a TMS is not the hardest thing in the world because essentially it's a peripheral system to the core of the enterprise, right? Their ERP, their manufacturing systems, their merchandising systems, those are kind of the heart of the company. Transportation's certainly critical, but it's not the heart of what they do. It's an enabler for what they do. So yes, you can rip it out. It doesn't put the whole company at risk in the same way it might in other industries. But the question has to be why. There's got to be a pretty significant reason to do so, significant ROI, because I still have built out all those integrations. Then again, if you think about the forwarders, different story, right? The TMS, that's the heartbeat of what they do. That is their operating system. Every part of that business is linked to that TMS. And so it's a big deal to pull that out, especially if you're a large DB Schenker, DSV, Kuehne Nagel, one of the big guys that are dealing with all the various modes and different regions and different instances and different regions and different rules and everything. Then it becomes, it's like replacing SAP if you're a big retailer.
I think the reference to SAP kind of makes me think, I think there was a period, and this was particularly true after COVID, where it was or during, towards the end of COVID and after, where supply chain, it was all about supply chain, right? There's a tremendous amount of funding coming in. It kind of, suddenly chief supply chain officers had a seat, in the board, and were really, had a much louder voice. And then that kind of drew this push in of, Salesforce to try to get more involved in logistics and transportation, and a bunch of other technology companies. Do you think that that's kind of companies, non-logistics companies, have soured on trying to make that move, and that this is getting left again for like supply chain and logistics native technology? Or do you feel like supply chain is going to remain a core focus for a lot of these non-logistics companies?
Thought about that. And I'm not quite sure. My mind immediately goes to Amazon, because I remember a few years ago, Amazon announced they were their own supply chain tech. And I've had some former colleagues of mine from Manhattan Associates went over there and they started building it out. I don't think much came out of it. They certainly used it for their own benefit, but it doesn't seem to have a whole lot of commercial success. So if I think about the companies where supply chain is not core to what they sell, and certainly Amazon supply chain is core to everything they do, but like a Salesforce, I don't know. I mean, let's think about, kind of my roots, WMS. The WMS market at its maximum is, I think, what, a $1 billion market, or $1.5, $2 billion market, something like that. So look, a nice size market, and there's some great companies in that space. I think TMS is in a similar scale, right? Nobody has more than 10 or 15% of the market share. So let's say SAP or Salesforce or somebody else was wildly successful, and they got 50% market share, which we don't think would ever happen. So let's say they get $500 to $700 million out of that. Don't get me wrong, that's significant. But on the scale of the things that they're doing in other areas, don't know if it moves the needle enough compared to the level of investment that they would have to make to get there. So I think a lot of these companies are building enough to make sure the companies who say it's good enough can use it just fine. But I'm not sure they're ever really focused on becoming more than good enough to become a category leader. Because I think the level of investment energy it takes compared to the potential payoff, not sure the math quite works for them.
$1 billion for an SAP, not a huge market, but $1 billion for a tech company, decent enough market to raise like a decent round. And now suddenly with coding getting much more commoditized, and it becoming much easier for people to bring their own kind of TMS or WMS out, whether it's in-house or externally, that means that it's not suddenly not as interesting. The profit margins on SaaS are likely to drop significantly. Suddenly it's not as fundable. Do you anticipate this will actually put a damper on innovation because there's just like much less money and far fewer people that are going to be looking at this as a market? Or do you think, hey, the gates are unlocked, anybody can go build here, just like go at it as hard as you can?
If I'm in the US, where I am, and I want cheap coding, I can always go to India and pay a quarter the price. So coding was always, there were always ways of making it less expensive. Now, it's even more less expensive now. But I think the bottleneck has never really been about coding capacity. Of course, it's about coding capacity, and every product manager wants more capacity. There's never been a roadmap that wasn't infinite. But I think really where the rubber hits the road is the ideation. It's the strategy. It's deciding what to build. And yes, I would always love to build more faster. But a lot of companies, I would vet, most roadmaps that I look at, I think 3/4 of the roadmap is daily business. It's building this bell, this whistle, fixing bugs. And yes, I mean, AI can certainly make that a lot faster. I don't know that many companies that are really pushing the boundary. I think it rests on, granted, I'm biased, right? I'm a CPO by nature, and I'm a product guy, but it rests on the ideas. And if you don't have somebody who's actually looking actively for product market fit and doing something different and innovation, and that's really hard, then all the coding capacity in the world will only get you so far. I'm not sure if that's exactly what to answer your question, but that's very, very, very much topical right now.
One thing that I want to pull back to, you're saying that the core TMSs, core WMSs, they're most likely going to maintain their kind of status. And that means that there's more of a strategy of bolt-ons. What are the implications of that? Like, where does that play out on like the broader logistics technology market?
I think about it in terms of transactions. And if you think about the number of transactions that occur in a transportation network or the number of transactions that actually happen within a warehouse. It doesn't matter what AI I put in place or whatever technology I put in place. The number of transactions roughly stays the same. It won't increase unless I'm shipping more or receiving more or tracking more or anything else. And so you've got almost picture kind of stack of transactions that occur in my transaction network or in my transportation network. This is where the turf war is going to happen, right? You've got the TMS kind of coming from the bottom because it's a system of record, trying to capture as many of those transactions as possible. Because the more transaction it has, the more value it creates, the more important it is, the higher I can pay, right? And likewise, you now got these new add-on systems that are trying to come in from the top and eat as many of those transactions as possible. So that's where the turf war happens. I'll give you an example. For a long time, the visibility providers really weren't eating away at those transactions. The visibility in general, in theory at least, was kind of add-on. But there's only so far you could take it. And if you look at the recent pivots from Project 44 and Forkites and probably a few others, is they've now moved into execution. It started relatively innocently enough with yard management, but now the agents they've created, they've come out and said, we can plan your transportation. We can do your load. We can track your load as well, which we've always done. And so they're eating into that stack and they're trying to make the TMS less relevant. So I think whether you're looking at transportation, you're looking at warehousing, that's where the real battle for the next couple of years is going to be fought.
Ultimately, the pie is X transactions, and that's all there is. The room for margins in transactions in global logistics is not particularly high, right? You're saying the transactions are not important from a monetization perspective. Transactions are important because it means that you are so deeply embedded in the system that you can't be pulled out, right? And that's the real moat. It's just like owning the transaction because then you are unreplaceable from a company perspective.
It's an interesting way to put it. I was listening to a podcast just last week, and it was somebody from Andreessen, I believe, who was talking about transactions, talking about how you build competitive moats. And for a long time, functionality was how you built a competitive moat. If I had a better optimization engine, if I had more bells, more whistles, that's how I kept competitors out. And that's how I differentiated, won more deals and the like. Well, with AI making coding a lot cheaper, that means that functionality is almost becoming commoditized. And when that happens, how do you differentiate? One way is data. And so back to your comment about transactions, that's the way to get your proprietary and live data is by owning the transactions. If somebody else owns the transactions and I'm simply consuming the data and doing a bit of data manipulation, which is what I think the visibility providers did for a long time, then I'm not really having a competitive moat. I'm not able to stand up against everybody else because all I'm doing is using someone else's data. If I own that data, if it's rates, for instance, if it is a carrier performance or anything else, and it's my data and I'm updating it on a real-time basis or near real-time basis, that's differentiation. By the way, I'll say another way to differentiate besides the data and owning the transactions, I still think risk matters. In a world where 5 guys can build out a brand new TMS in 6 months, I think what's going to really matter is for businesses that really depend on that TMS, think your classic freight forwarder, risk. How much can I count on a 5-person company with a bit of funding? How many times have they proven it? Now, I do think companies might be more readily able to make their own enhancements to existing TMS, and I think that's a different conversation. But I personally believe that risk and have you done it, where have you done it, and can I count on you as a business to have staying power? Yeah, I think it still matters.
I would add one thing on top of that risk, which is there's a function of risk and how core is it to the business.
Yes.
And that kind of becomes, and maybe this is also, taking it back to what you were talking about, BCOs versus freight forwarders. If a TMS is core to a business and they are incredibly, all in on it, I think that's a really strong case to build it yourself because you're de-riskifying yourself, right? And you're reducing your costs. Whereas on a BCO, the risk is high if you switch out, but the underlying savings are very low if you build it yourself or relatively low if you build it yourself. And therefore kind of like both of those play off of each other. And it's like a function of risk, but also a function of cost of ownership.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. If I can start building things myself, what should I build? And you're only going to have a limited number of people who are really good builders, even if you can build very quickly. and good testers and deployers and support and everything else, right? And so if I'm a freight forwarder, am I going to build an HR system or a finance system, anything that's relatively commoditized versus I can get that from Sage or SAP or anybody else, that's probably not the best use of resources. Yes, I can save the $300,000 a year, bill I get from my ERP provider, whatever that number is, but it's more about opportunity cost. If I've only got so many cycles to build and so many people who can do the good building, what allows me to build differentiated capability for my competition? For a freight forwarder, that may very well be the TMS. For a retailer, it probably isn't. It's probably something with the website or the mobile app or something about the consumer experience. And so back to your point about kind of mission critical, I suspect how important and core something is to a company's success will drive in a big way how likely they are to build it versus buy it.
When we were prepping for the call, you were telling me about a book that you had recently written that's pretty relevant for these conversations, specifically around supply chain. Maybe kind of give me the quick overview on what that is and kind of how that relates to supply chain professionals that are trying to navigate this world today.
Yeah, I appreciate you asking. Not for the shameless plug, but it is called Finding Purpose. And it's really all about both personal and professional growth and ways that whether you're a 23-year-old or a 53-year-old, how you can figure out what your purpose is and how you can make progress towards that. Stefan Sieber, my CEO from Transporian, he had a quote one time that really stuck with me, and I have a chapter about this in the book. His quote was, "We should change because we can, not because we have to." And he really led a transformation of the business, both through strategic growth as well as acquisitions and organic and the like, and really changed the business. And his point was, if we don't make these proactive moves, somebody else is going to come in and take our market share. And I think the same holds for any business here. Right now, we're at a point in time where companies can change. They can start experimenting with AI. They can start looking at how they can use it or other technologies to improve what they're doing. And by the way, this is not just technology providers. It certainly is, but it also is operators, be it freight forwarders or BCOs or anybody else. There's going to come a point in time, probably in the next 2 to 4 years, where those companies aren't able to change. They have to change. And they've got to respond. At that point, it's much like your health, right? I'm 52 years old. I'm at the point now where I start paying attention to my health more regularly. I can be proactive and focus on my diet and focus on my exercise level and the like, and everything is fine. At some point, if I'm not, I go to the doctor and they say, you got high blood pressure, you got high cholesterol. At that point, I have to change my lifestyle, take medication, and you can't really go back. It's no different in business. If I wake up one day and a competitor has got a significant differentiated capability, again, whether it's a software company with a new module, or it's a freight forwarder who's deployed some new capability, suddenly I'm now forced to react. And when you react, you can't control the path that you take, and odds are you can't control the time in which you have to take that decision. And so things get rushed, and you don't get the optimal outcome. So back to the quote, if you change when you can as opposed to when you have to, you have time to experiment, you have time to fail, and you have time to find the right path. And so I think all of us right now, when we're at such a pivotal point in time in this industry, should be focusing on change while we can, as opposed to when we have to.
This was like a fascinating conversation. I know it's like exactly at the intersect of the dweeby stuff that we like to think about here. So really, really appreciate it. It was great having you. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.